In this lecture, we'll consider some of the earliest ideas that seem to threaten free will. Most broadly, the threat to free will comes from the claim that our actions are necessary, that what we do had to happen, that it was inevitable that we would have done what we did. But there are several different notions of necessity that have been developed in the history of thought, and the next three lectures will look at different notions of necessity. One of the earliest and most familiar ideas of necessity is the notion of fate, that certain events are bound to happen. And we use this expression in ordinary English when we say things like, it was fate that would happen, or you can't escape your fate. But if we want to examine whether fate poses a threat to free will, we obviously need to get much clearer about what fate is supposed to amount to. The idea of fate plays a central role in the Greek tradition of philosophy, which represents the earliest major tradition in Western philosophy. And so many of the ideas that we have in Western philosophy ultimately get traced back to the Greeks. Fatalism is a doctrine that's tied to the idea of fate, obviously, and it maintains that certain events are bound to happen no matter what one does, that the outcome was inevitable, it was necessary regardless of the causes, that it really had to happen. And the standard example that gets used to illustrate this is Oedipus, as presented in Sophocles' play Oedipus Rex, which appeared in roughly 429 BCE. And in the play, Oedipus was fated to kill his father and marry his mother. And even though they did everything they could to prevent this, it still came to pass. And so one reading of the play is that it didn't matter what Oedipus did. It didn't matter what his father did or his mother did. It was going to happen that he would kill his father and marry his mother. The way the story actually unfolds is that Oedipus's father, Laius, went to the oracle after his son was born to ask the oracle what the future had in store for his new boy. And the oracle told him that the future had in store that the boy would murder Laius. So Laius and Jocasta went to enormous lengths to avoid this terrible fate. They drove a spike through the boy's feet and left him abandoned in the woods to die. But he was ultimately rescued and raised by another couple, and toward the middle of his life, he leaves them because he fears that he will kill them, and he thinks he will kill his father. He thinks that's his real father. So he leaves that area and crosses Laius in his path and ends up killing Laius, not knowing that it's his father. So this all happened even though everybody, Oedipus, Laius, and Jocasta, was doing their best to avoid the outcome. So it looks like this was something that was absolutely necessary. There was no way to get out of it. There was no way to avoid this particular terrible result. In the play, there's no appeal to the gods as explaining Oedipus's outcome. There's no claim that, well, the gods determined that this is what should happen, that Oedipus should kill his father. But the play indicates that the outcome was unavoidable nonetheless. Fate also plays a central role in Homer's epic poem, the Iliad, which dates back to about 750 BCE. This is Homer's poem about Achilles and the Trojan War. And in the poem, we have a number of examples where we're told what fate has in store. So just to take two examples, it's fate that Prince Hector will be killed by Achilles. That's something that's going to happen. It's also fate that Troy will fall in the war, that Troy will be on the losing side. In the Iliad, the fatalistic worldview begins to get personified as fate, that there is fate that determines things. So this is somehow separate from the gods that are discussed elsewhere in the poem. So, for instance, we get Achilles being told, "Stern fate will destroy you." But there's little more said about what fate is supposed to be. Gradually, though, in Greek literature, we get greater and greater personification of fate. It becomes more specific. And at a certain point, the fates are actually identified as three gods, Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos. So they're distinguished from the rest of the gods. They are these special gods, the fates. But the relation between fate and the gods is really quite delicate. One strand of Greek thought holds that the fates cause everything. Everything that happens is a product of fate. But this conflicts with the view that the gods have the power to change fate. And so this raises a kind of weird fact about how to understand the relation between the gods and the fates. So Zeus is not one of the fates, but he's supposed to be the most powerful of the Greek gods. But there's a funny tension there in how we're supposed to think about Zeus. How can he be so powerful if everything is fated? And the Syrian philosopher Lucian exposes these tensions in his wonderful satire, which is called Zeus Catechized. The first thing he does is Lucian points out how weird it is to make sacrifices to the gods if everything is already set in stone by fate. And the work proceeds as a dialogue between his character Cyniscus and Zeus. And Lucian has his character Cyniscus say to Zeus, "If the fates rule everything, why do we men sacrifice to you gods and make you great offerings of cattle, praying to receive blessings from you? I really don't see what benefit we can derive from this precaution if it is impossible for us through our prayers either to get what is bad averted or to secure any blessing whatever by the gift of the gods." Zeus responds saying, "See here, your talk is getting insulting, Cyniscus, and you will perhaps regret it someday." But Cyniscus isn't worried by this. He tells Zeus that his threats are idle, saying, "You know that nothing can happen to me which fate has not decreed before you." And at this, Zeus himself seems to get a little worried. And he says, "Then you leave nothing for us, and we are gods to no purpose, not contributing any providence to the world?" After a bit of self-reflection, Zeus goes on to say, "Indeed, it seems to me that you scorn me with reason, because although, as you see, I have a thunderbolt clenched in my hand, I am letting you say all this against us." Lucian's point in all this is, of course, that it just doesn't make sense to say that Zeus is a powerful, fearsome god if the fates control everything. If our lives are entirely governed by fate, then there's little point in worrying about Zeus. Zeus can't throw thunderbolts at me unless that was already fated. If it was fated, then I can't escape it. And if it wasn't fated, then Zeus can't even do it. Lucian goes on to point out that there also seem to be implications for responsibility, and he even questions the propriety of punishment. He says, "If fate is the cause of everything," then he has his character say, "if a man slay, it is she who slays. And if he robs temples, he only does it under orders." This picture of fate that we get from Lucian is probably not the typical view of fate among the Greeks, philosophers, or the ordinary citizens. That this is a particularly extreme view of fate that we get presented in Lucian's satire. And if we think about the more typical view of fate, we can look partly to the Iliad to get some kind of indication of this. So the question for us is, what is the reach of fate? How much does it affect everyday life, and how much is it guaranteed? In the Iliad, Zeus acknowledges the existence of fate, but he apparently has the power to intervene. And in a well-known passage, Zeus discusses the fact that his son Sarpedon is fated to die in the Trojan War. But Zeus doesn't want this. He doesn't want his son to die in the war. He wants to save him and send him off to a land where he can have a prosperous, long life away from the war. But Zeus's wife Hera protests this and argues that even though, of course, Zeus is capable of doing this, he's capable of countermanding the orders of fate. He's capable of doing something else, saving his son from fate. But Hera says it would be a really bad idea, because if he did this, other gods will want to intervene on behalf of their own favored mortals. So the picture that we get from Hera and Zeus is that Zeus has the capacity to go against fate. It's not that he has that restriction, but in the particular case of saving his son, it would be imprudent of him to go against fate. A second important point about the notion of fate in the Greeks is that for many Greek theologians and philosophers, the gods and fate don't dictate every little behavior of the mortals. It's not like every little thing that happens is fixed by fate. Instead, it was the major life events like death and marriage and injury and the outcome of a war. Those were the things that were fated, that were a product of fate. We'll want to consider the extent to which fate challenges free will and responsibility. We want to look at both of those questions. So let's start with free will. Does fate pose a threat to free will? Well, as I just mentioned, in Greek cosmology, in their view of the universe, fate is probably just local fate. It's fate for particular life events. It's not that every single thing that happens is a product of fate. So it might have been inevitable that Oedipus would marry his mother because that was fated. But it wasn't inevitable how he would plan the wedding or who he would invite or where they would have the rehearsal dinner. These things were left open to Oedipus and Jocasta to plan their wedding as they pleased, because what was fated was just the particular thing: Oedipus would marry Jocasta. Now that will allow for considerable freedom in life, because if just a few events are punctuating the life, a few events that are fated punctuate our lives, but most of what happens in our life is not fated, then we still have a good degree of freedom. Now, you might wonder, well, what about the cases where the outcome was inevitable, where it really did have to happen that the outcome would come to pass? There still might be a degree of free will, because free will might have been exercised in selecting the path that led to this outcome. So in the case of Oedipus, all paths ultimately led to catastrophe. All the paths ultimately led to him killing his father and marrying his mother. But he still might have freely chosen between various options that would ultimately lead to this terrible conclusion. Now, obviously, it's still kind of creepy, because the terrible consequence, killing his father, was inevitable. That couldn't be avoided. But there still could be a degree of free will here. To see how, imagine that you come to a path, you're on a walk, you need to get somewhere, and you come to a forking path, and you see it goes left and right, you choose the left fork, and a little while later you're walking along the path and you see that the right fork joins with the left fork, that you would have gotten to exactly this same spot if you had taken the right fork. Even though you ended up in the same place, we'd still say that you freely chose the path that you took, the left path. Similarly then, even though it was fated that Oedipus would kill his father, he might have made several free choices along the way. It's just that every choice that he made would ultimately lead to the same spot. It would ultimately lead to the same conclusion, killing his father. So there can be an element of free will in the choices that somebody makes on the path to achieving their fate. There is, though, a lurking worry here about control. If my outcome is fated by the gods, do I really have control over the action? It seems like you might challenge this idea, because Oedipus had no power, no capacity to avoid the outcome of killing his father. And so we might wonder, does it really count as free? The second kind of question that we need to consider is, does fate undermine responsibility? If a certain action is fated, does that mean that the person who did the action is not responsible for it? As in virtually all known cultures, the Greeks thought that people are typically responsible for their actions. As a result, it's typically appropriate to blame people for the bad things that they do because they deserve it. This is to be contrasted with how we think about inanimate objects. At least when we're being reflective, we don't think that rocks and storm systems are responsible agents. And so we don't think that the hurricane deserves to be blamed for the destruction that it causes. But people, on the other hand, we're exactly the sort of thing that seem appropriate bases to think are responsible. We're the appropriate kind of thing to blame for our actions. But then, what about when the action that we perform was fated? If fate produced the action, are we still responsible? We get a challenge to this idea, a challenge to the idea that a person is responsible for an action that's fated in the Iliad again. The Iliad begins with the dispute between King Agamemnon and Achilles. Agamemnon had stolen Achilles' prize, namely a woman that Achilles had captured from the enemy. But this provides one of the critical plot points in the epic. If you read this, you'll see Agamemnon seems to be completely unreasonable. There are all these arguments for why he should give Achilles his prize back, that he was unfair in taking the prize in the first place, and so he should give it back. And Achilles is furious about it. And what is particularly significant is that they're on the same side in the war. They're both fighting against the Trojans. And this affects their ability, this fight, this dispute between them affects their ability to wage war together. Later in the Iliad, Agamemnon refers back to this episode, this fight with Achilles, and he seems to deny responsibility for it. He says, quote, "I am not to blame. Zeus and fate and the fury stalking through the night, they are the ones who drove that savage madness in my heart." And then he continues, he says, "That day in the assembly when I seized Achilles' prize, on my own authority, true, but what could I do? A god impels all things to their fulfillment." By blaming the action, by blaming his dispute on Zeus and the fates and fury, Agamemnon seems to be trying to absolve himself of any blame. And one recent scholar has suggested that this passage is the first instance of the insanity defense. And indeed, Agamemnon continues his excuse by saying, "Ruin Zeus's eldest daughter, she blinds us all, that fatal madness." And so we do get something like the idea that Agamemnon is claiming, I'm not responsible because at that moment I was insane. So far, we've allowed that only some of our actions are fated, that is the idea that we're exploring in the Greeks, that only some of our actions are fated. But even if that's true, if it's only some of the actions that have this feature that they were bound to happen, it still raises difficult questions about whether we are responsible for those actions, the ones which are fated. And since the fated outcomes are often the most momentous parts of our lives, like death, and in Oedipus's case, marriage and murder, this question becomes really pressing. And we find this conflict, this worry about the relationship between fate and responsibility in another great Greek work, the play by Aeschylus, Agamemnon. In the play, Agamemnon has returned home from the war, the Trojan War, and his wife, Clytemnestra, murders him. But she claims that she's not responsible for it. The chorus in the play dismisses the claim and says, how outrageous, how could she say such a thing that she's not responsible for it? We caught her red-handed, basically. But they go on to acknowledge that there is something awkward here to say that she's responsible since, as they say, which of these events is not God ordained? Similarly, then, each of Oedipus's decisions might have been free in some sense, but can he really be morally responsible if the ultimate end, killing his father, was unavoidable? It seems difficult to come to terms with that. If he really produced this action out of fate, if it was inevitable, there was nothing he could do about it, it's hard to see how we can hold him fully responsible. So far, we've been looking just at Greek notions of necessity, but we find a quite different idea of necessity in Indian philosophy and religion. Karma is obviously a central notion in Indian philosophy and religion. And it's an idea that's familiar from everyday life in the West. We talk about karma, but the idea of karma traces back to Hindu scriptural texts from long ago, the Upanishads, which date to roughly 700 to 500 BCE. And it's developed more fully in the later work, the Mahabharata, which dates to 400 CE. In the West, we usually talk about karma pretty casually in terms of current happenings. So you might say, the reason a bad thing is happening to me now is because of something I did earlier, say in a past life. But it's also the case on karmic theory that the actions I perform now are supposed to have karmic effects on the future. And so the general way to think about karma, the general account of what karma is it's the power of actions to impose consequences on a person in the future. That what you do now has consequences in the future. That's the karma, the setting up of these consequences. An associated doctrine is that all of the suffering and enjoyment that an individual undergoes is deserved because it's based on the qualities of their past actions. If they performed good actions in the past, then their experiences will be good. When they perform bad actions in the past, their current experiences will be bad. So if I perform a bad action now, there will be some payback in the future. That's part of the idea of karma. Every bad thing I do, I will get some kind of appropriate punishment for. So all of the suffering that I undergo in my life is deserved. It's deserved because of what I did in the past. And this provides the basis for a kind of justice, that what people do in this life will be rewarded or punished as appropriate in the next life. So I've already mentioned the next life, and you probably already know that karma is also tied to the idea of reincarnation, this doctrine of rebirth. And according to the doctrine of rebirth, individuals go through this constant cycle of birth, death, and then rebirth. This process of rebirth is supposed to have no beginning. The self has no beginning. And it's governed by a person's karma. And so the way it works is roughly as follows. Karma accumulates throughout a lifetime, and then this determines the conditions of one's next existence, including the amount of pain and pleasure that will be experienced in that next existence. Karma differs from Greek fate in really important ways. For one thing, it doesn't depend on the gods causing the outcomes. As I said about the Greek case, the notion of fate ends up getting personified, increasingly personified, so that it's at a certain point identified with three specific gods. But karma is never personified as a god. Even though Hinduism has lots of gods, none of them is karma. A second point of difference between fate and karma is that the consequences of karma are never arbitrary. They're always deserved. And this isn't so clearly the case in the Greek notion of fate. Indeed, the third point about karma is that it reflects a kind of pervasive, even cosmic justice. Everything that happens in the universe is just. By contrast, it seems like fate is often really arbitrary. No reason is given to us for why Oedipus deserves to kill his father, deserves to marry his mother, and then ultimately poke his eyes out with some jewelry that he finds. Fate for the Greeks often just seems to be at the whim of the gods, and that is not the case for the idea of karma. Some have thought that karma precludes the possibility of free will, because karma dictates what one will be in the next life. So it might seem like that means that we have no choice, that since karma dictates what I will be, I have no free will. But many traditional views of karma would reject this assessment, would reject the idea that karma is inconsistent with free will. And one reason is that karma is at least often thought not to be global. It's not something that holds for every single event, every single choice, every single action. In this sense, karma is like the Greek idea of fate, that it's just particular kinds of things that are fated, and there are particular kinds of things that are governed by karma. But critically, one thing that is not determined by karma is moral action. When I make a moral decision, if I'm trying to decide whether to do a good thing or a bad thing, that decision is not dictated by karma. Indeed, you might think that the idea of karma presupposes some kind of freedom and responsibility. The whole point of karma is that you're getting what you deserve because of what you chose in past circumstances. So it's only because you're free and responsible that you will suffer the karmic effects, that you will suffer the consequences of the karmic law. In addition, a related doctrine that's associated with Hinduism is that the whole aim of the cycle of death and rebirth is getting out of it, is getting released from this cycle. That what you want to do is do the right thing, become a morally good person, behave morally correctly so that you can get out of the cycle of birth, death, rebirth. When you're finally released from the cycle, you enjoy true knowledge and freedom from all suffering. And this doctrine, too, many scholars think, assumes that what you're doing is you're freely choosing to behave morally so that you can get that final release. So the idea is, I am going to try to be a good person so that I will be able to get out of this cycle. But when I try to be a good person, it's supposed that I'm doing it freely. I'm making free choices. And this really is a special case here, the idea of getting out of the cycle of death and rebirth, that an individual gets moral credit when he makes good choices. And that will redound to his favor in the future. And that's how he gets out of the cycle. So karma presents a very different notion of necessity from fate, because although on this notion we have outcomes that are inevitable, it's not based on the whim of the gods, but on actions having effects that will persist well into the future. To contemporary Western ears, talk of fate, fatalism, and even karma all seem kind of quaint. In the scientific worldview that dominates in certainly Western universities, these ideas have no serious currency as metaphysical theories of the way the world is. A standard philosophical characterization is that it's, quote, mystical and superstitious. That's from Dan Dennett's book, Elbow Room. And that we should just have no truck at all with these ideas of fate, and fatalism, and karma. But it's important to recognize that fate and karma are pervasive features of historical cultures. As we've seen, fate and karma were central to early Greek and Indian societies. The doctrine of karma and rebirth spread in traditions in China and Japan, thereby showing its cultural strength, its power to attract adherents. And even today, many people in India believe in the law of karma. This is an idea that has a great deal of resonance for people. In Christianity and Islam, we also get related ideas in terms of certain outcomes being God's will, that happened because it's God's will. And that is something that's pretty closely tied to these ideas of fate and karma. Why then are these ideas that we find so well represented across the globe and so culturally resilient, why are they so powerful? And I think that regardless of whether you think that fate exists or karma exists, it's a really interesting question why it's such a powerful cultural force. Why do people believe in these things? I think that there is a kind of a deep answer to this question, or a deep explanation of this. And part of it is that we want to think of major events in our lives as meaningful. So if a loved one dies in a traffic accident, we want to think that this wasn't just random, this wasn't just an irrelevant thing that happened, some fluke. We want to think that it happened for a reason. We want to think there's some explanation for why it happened. And indeed, that might be part of the reason that we find the Greeks focusing on fate as causing major life events. Those are the ones that we want to be able to say, yeah, that was going to happen, that had to happen. Or, to take a different kind of example, consider the popularity of conspiracy theories for major world events. Is Elvis really dead, or was there a conspiracy that is trying to make us think that he's dead? Did we really land on the moon, or is there some kind of vast conspiracy to tell us that we landed when we really didn't? Or, most famously, was JFK really assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald, or was there some conspiracy involving the mafia and the Russians and the CIA? These kinds of explanations have a lot of traction. People are attracted to these kinds of conspiracy theories. And I'm not saying that there wasn't a conspiracy to kill JFK. I haven't studied the matter. I don't know. But one explanation that psychologists have given for why these kinds of theories are so captivating, for why people find them so attractive, is because they confer a kind of deeper meaning on the event. So if you can say, John F. Kennedy wasn't killed by a lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, just by that. It wasn't just that. It was something that was more appropriately congruous, like the CIA and the mafia and the Russians. That would give it a kind of heft that seems more appropriate to the actual significance of the event of killing one of the most important figures in 20th century American politics. So it seems like we want major events to be infused with meaning. Fate gives one way of funding this. We can say it was destined to happen. It was unavoidable. It wasn't a simple accident. And that can be somewhat reassuring to think that it was inevitable. Karma, though, seems like it's even more satisfying. The things that happen have their source in what the person did in their past life. So it's not just that important things happen for a reason. With karma, they always happen for a good reason. You get what you deserve. That all of the things, bad things that happen to you for a good reason because of what you did in a past life. And this gives a kind of broad notion of justice that we find really attractive, that really resonates with the way we think about things. The idea that when people do bad things, it will come back to them. Today, I focused on two notions of necessity, fate and karma, and one thing that they have in common is that both can be construed locally, that they both can be construed as applying to particular kinds of events, but not to everything, that not every single decision a person makes, not every single event that happens is inevitable if you accept the theory of fate or if you accept the theory of karma. So there doesn't seem to be a global threat here to free will. In the next lectures, we'll look at accounts of necessity that are global, that claim that every single thing that happens is necessary. Everything that happens is inevitable. And those seem like they might pose a more serious problem for the prospect of free will.